Good evening and welcome to another live stream with Friends of Science Society. I'm Michelle Stirling, Communications Manager for Friends of Science Society, and I'm happy to welcome all of you this evening to our live stream. I'd be happy to get your questions in the chat, although right off the bat I want to say that I'm presenting this as a spokesperson and some of the questions are rather technical. So I propose that people should refer to the actual report or send us any of your technical questions by email. However, simpler questions we can answer from the chat. So tonight's topic is what you really need to know about renewable energy that a Pembina Institute won't tell you. And maybe that sounds like we're throwing a little shade on them, but what you really need to know about renewable energy is a lot of detailed quantitative analysis. So if we look at what renewable energy policy papers Pembina is putting out, here's something that they put out in August 2020. Pembina Institute claimed that Alberta has some of the best renewable resources in Canada. They said that there are significant opportunities to supply the majority of Alberta households and industries with reliable, cheap, and clean energy. Well, that just sounds great, but it's too bad that that's wrong. They also claim that with the falling costs of solar and wind energy, our electricity sector has entered a new reality where renewable generation is the most economical source of new electricity generation for the province. And of course, lots of media outlets also make similar claims of cheap wind and solar. But like I said, it sounds great, but too bad that's wrong. And now we're going to walk through and see what's wrong with it. So based on the Pembina Institute paper, they do not understand the physical and market operations of Alberta's electric power system. They provided incomplete analyses that ignore critical details. They cherry-pick data. They also fail to acknowledge the massive and ever-increasing implicit subsidies that Albertans are providing to wind and solar generators. And they ignored the crucial role played by fossil fuel generators, the very generators that many green energy advocates love to hate, in allowing wind and solar generators to operate in the first place. So, if you're not familiar with the term cherry picking, it refers to highlighting data that supports one's case while hiding or ignoring data that does not. So basically, what's wrong with the Pembina's rosy picture of renewables? Rose-colored spectacles are not reality. So the reality of renewables is not so rosy. Pembina's evaluation of solar energy for Alberta fails because the number of homes that can reliably be served by solar energy alone is 0. Southern Alberta solar resources are not equivalent to those in Miami or Rio de Janeiro. And paying for energy storage needed to turn solar generation into a reliable electricity source using today's technology would put the purchase of electricity beyond the financial reach of most Alberta families. So why is that? Well, there are 5 electricity standards for power generation: abundant, affordable, reliable, scalable, and flexible. And Pembina Institute is advocating for generation that does not meet any of these standards. The inconvenient truth about wind and solar is that it requires massive amounts of fossil fuels for the making of wind and solar devices, for transporting, for installing, for maintaining, and even for operating. So if you want to get more information on this, Václav Smil is a professor emeritus from the University of Manitoba. He's written about 40 books on the subject of energy, and he's deemed to be the best author on energy by Bill Gates. And he's got a number of very good essays. He did a public policy paper for the University of Saskatchewan on the energy transition. He's got a very good lecture that he gave to McGill engineering students, which is on YouTube. And, if you want like a more independent source, then go and see what Václav Smil has to say about renewables and about energy and about the energy transition. So just giving you some additional backup information. So let's see, where are we now? So to get wind power, you need oil, coal, and natural gas. And we also have quite a funny little video on that topic called the False Choice Cafe. And just to clarify how much natural gas you need, this is a quote from Robert F. Kennedy Jr. And he said we need about 3,000 feet of altitude, we need flat land, we need 300 days of sunlight, and we need to be near a gas pipe. Because for all of these big utility scale solar plants, whether it's wind or solar, everybody is looking at gas as the supplementary fuel. The plants that we're building, the wind plants and the solar plants, are gas plants. And you can see that if you look at various places in the world where they've added a lot of wind and solar, almost without exception, the amount of natural gas has also gone up. Now, one of the things that is not in our report, but is something that I think is very important, Pembina Institute, it has a number of lobbyists. They're very influential in Canada in terms of climate and energy policies. And I think that it's important to ask yourself, if they are that influential, should they not be also very accurate? And they also have received a number of contracts and grants from all levels of government in Canada. So taxpayers' money is supporting many of these kinds of reports, which are cheerleading green energy, but perhaps not telling the full story. And another aspect that we will look at shortly is that Pembina has also received substantial funding from foreign sources. So it might be worthwhile to ask yourself if there's any influence from offshore redirecting Canadian energy policies in ways that perhaps we don't want, or perhaps we're not fully informed about. So let's have a look at some of these things. So Pembina has a number of lobbyists that are influencing national policy. And you can see the list of lobbyists here. This is from the Canadian Lobbyist Registry, the federal one. And you can see the many areas that Pembina is influencing. The subject matters they deal with are budget, climate, economic development, employment and training, energy, environment, industry, infrastructure, regional development, taxation and finance, transportation. Wow. And they're dealing with all these different government institutions, the Canadian Energy Regulator, Canadian Heritage, Environment and Climate Change Canada, Finance Canada, Global Affairs Canada, Health Canada, House of Commons, the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada, Infrastructure Canada, Innovation, Science and Economic Development Canada, Natural Resources Canada, the Prime Minister's Office, Privy Council Office, the Senate of Canada, and Transport Canada. So the areas that they're dealing with, they're pushing for federal support for clean energy, energy efficiency and sustainable transportation, the Pan-Canadian Framework on Clean Growth and Climate Change, actions to enhance carbon sinks, phasing out tax preferences for fossil fuel producers, and presumably phasing in tax preferences for clean energy, so-called clean energy wind and solar producers. And the regulation areas they're dealing with are future federal greenhouse gas regulations on other economic sectors, emissions-intensive trade, exposed sectors, natural gas-fired electricity, etc. And future federal regulations on greenhouse gas emissions from the oil and gas sector. And Government of Canada review of proposed oil sands development and the application of regulations under the Canadian Environment Assessment Act, Fisheries Act, Species at Risk Act, National Energy Board Act, and Canadian Environmental Protection Act. So that's a lot of influence. And it's important to note that substantial sums of money are being paid to the Pembina Institute, either in the form of grants or contracts. And this is again from the Canadian Lobbyist Registry, and this is only the federal government and is not all of the funding. But we see that the Canadian Environment Assessment Agency came up with $248.75, which is not very much. But they got $20,000 from Environment and Climate Change Canada. The Federation of Canadian Municipalities granted them $30,000. And it must be said that the Federation of Canadian Municipalities has pushed very strongly for cities to incorporate renewable energy into their portfolios. Here's a big one, Natural Resources Canada, $682,373.39, and they're expected to receive more money from them. The Vancouver Coastal Health Authority, $7,500, and Western Economic Diversification in Canada, $86,597. So over the years, Pembina has received millions of dollars in contracts, grants, and funding for diverse projects from all different levels of government. And again, as I noted before, if you're going to be getting that kind of money and influencing policy in this way, then shouldn't it be that your work is accurate and complete? And there's another issue that people should think about, and that is the issue of foreign funding to Pembina. So for instance, this is just one thing that I ran across by accident actually on the web. Under the Energy Foundation of the US, in 2018, Pembina got $525 US. This is their charitable arm to support the education and outreach to build a clean energy future. Now, one might wonder if perhaps that energy foundation has vested interests in clean energy. I don't know, but it's certainly a question worth asking yourself. And there are also these grants. These are older grants. These are from the Oak Foundation, which has been associated with the tar sands campaign against the oil sands in Alberta. And you can see these are fairly substantial sums of money. And again, we have at the top, in 2012, they received $404,533 to develop scientifically accurate analysis of and raise awareness among Canadian public on the need for slower and more environmentally responsible tar sands development. Pembina advances clean energy solutions through research, education, consulting, and advocacy. Then, prior to that, in 2006, they received $51,458 to cover the costs of organizing and facilitating an international conference on renewable energy and the Clean Development Mechanism, which was a carbon trading mechanism of the United Nations. And that will be held in conjunction with COP11. We're now going up to COP26 coming up in November. They also received $479,678 US in 2007 to elevate awareness of policies and targets for energy efficiency and renewable energy in Canadian, national, and provincial energy plans that will lead to the regulation of large greenhouse gas emitters, the transformation of all energy using sectors to high efficiency, and the establishment of a major renewable energy infrastructure and investment in low carbon economies in developing countries. and then also here in 2005 to establish federal and provincial policies in Canada that will support on-the-ground development of low-impact renewable energy, energy efficiency, and conservation. And they received $269,000 and something for that. And also in 2010, they received $484,106 US to ensure that emerging opportunities and interest in renewable energy and energy efficiency solutions are not thwarted by opposing forces. Wonder who that could be. To develop and advocate for a suite of complementary sustainable transportation policies in key cities and provinces that reduce demand for fossil fuels and create cleaner and smarter transportation systems, and to equip U.S. policymakers, media, and environmental organizations with accurate and unbiased information about Canada's oil sands operations and climate policies. So, as I said, those are grants from the Oak Foundation, which is situated in Switzerland. It's a big donor to climate change issues around the world. They gave a grant of $75 million, for instance, to the Climate Works Foundation. So they put a lot of money out there. And again, I think it's worth asking oneself with the specifics of these grants. Is there foreign influence on domestic policy? And is it being presented as if a grassroots demand when it may be coming from some foreign body which may in fact have vested interests either in carbon trading, carbon markets, or the renewables themselves, or all of the above? So that's food for thought as we go through this. So if groups receive taxpayer funding, should they not be required to be accurate in policy proposals? And half a truth is a whole lie. So now we'll go back to the report critique. On page 1 of its report, Pembina states that wind farms secured through Alberta government's renewable electricity program will generate enough electricity to power 555,000 homes. On page 3, Pembina asserts that 100,000 megawatt hours is enough to power 15,700 Alberta homes for an entire year. These claims are examples of the half-truths that pervade the green energy advocacy. And why is it a half-truth? Well, producing a sufficient amount of energy over the course of a year solves only half the problem of providing a reliable supply of electricity. To solve the other half, the energy must be delivered when and where it is needed. And to see how obviously critical the other half is, just imagine that you have a meal service company that promised to meet your food needs for all of last year. If it delivered way too much food in the summer, about the right amount of food in the spring and fall, and way too little food in the winter, it might well have delivered enough food over the whole year, but in no sense did the company meet your nutritional needs, especially if it occasionally delivered no food at all for days at a time. So the problem with claiming that there's free energy is that taxpayers are subsidizing this, or that it's cheap, or that it's affordable. And in the Pembina report, Pembina acknowledges that storage is required in a clean energy portfolio, but the authors conspicuously fail to consider that the energy storage needed by solar generators today is in the form of fossil fuels. And fossil fuels are paid for not by those generators like the solar farms, as should be the case, but by Alberta ratepayers through one of the several implicit subsidies that renewable generators receive. So just to explain that a little bit, the power grid has to have supply and demand met in concert all the time with very, very minuscule change. So the problem with wind and solar is that they're both quite variable. And when they put out a lot of energy, the conventional generators, because they are conventional, it's called dispatchable generators, they're able to turn down or reduce or constrain the power that they're supplying to the grid. So then the renewable energy can go on the grid. But when it drops off, those generators, particularly the natural gas combined cycle generators, they're on spinning reserves. They're able and standing by to jump in immediately and pick up the slack when wind or solar drops off. Now, wind and solar plants don't pay for that backup. You pay for that backup. And basically, the problem with a lot of wind and solar on the grid is that you've created a dual system that has to be running all the time. The backup system always has to be running on standby, ready to pick up when the wind and solar drop off. And they're very, very erratic. And they're also a different form of energy generation. They're direct current, whereas the grid is alternating current. So there are a lot of costs involved in integrating wind and solar on the grid that the public are not aware of. Some of them are transmission lines, because wind and solar farms are generally, in some remote location. Those transmission lines are extremely expensive. The transmission line, it's a 500 kilovolt from Calgary to Pincher Creek wind farms, costs $2.2 billion. There's also the integration costs, the inverters to change the form of electrical generation so that it works on the grid. There's the forecasting of wind and solar to try and accurately respond and be ready to respond in advance, particularly with wind, because it's quite volatile in Alberta and very strong. So the grid operator, which is the Alberta Electric System Operator, has to be able to forecast, when might it drop off? So there are some good forecasting tools now, but it's still weather, and weather is quite erratic. So, that's rather plain language summary of some of the issues involved in wind and solar. I hope that you'll refer to the report itself and also refer to the reports at the end where we explain more of these details. These reports were written by either professional engineers or by Robert Lyman, an energy economist who's been on this case for more than 40 years. So please look at the actual reports for the full story on these details. That's just to give you a bit of an idea. Now, there are these implicit subsidies, and there's actually also real ones. But we're going to look now at the claim by Pembina that Southern Alberta's solar resources are equivalent to Miami or Rio de Janeiro. This is an integral part of their report. So this is figure 1 from their report. And you can see here that they've drawn this little line here showing the area that they say is the best solar in Canada. This is a map of the photovoltaic power potential in North America. So Southern Alberta's potential, which lies in the 1400, here we are, to 1600 range, which is kilowatt hours per kilowatt peak. And if we look at the bottom, that means kilowatt peak means kilowatts peak, a ratio at which a solar array generates power at peak performance. Kilowatt hour per kilowatt peak refers to the kilowatt hours of energy produced in a year for each kilowatt of peak output capacity. So anyhow, when we look back here, Alberta's potential lies in the 1400 to 1600 yield range. It's well below the 1900 to 2100 range, which is kind of that bright red, and you see that brighter red down here. These are fantastic solar potential areas. That means there's also problems with that, but they're not the same as our area. So you can see that parts of Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, and north central Mexico are very good kilowatt hour per kilowatt peak areas. But Pembina's own map not only misleadingly claims that southern Alberta solar resources are excellent, it extends that claim to include this large swath of land here, which is east of Lake Winnipeg and into western Ontario, whose solar potential is as low as 1,300 kilowatt hours per kilowatt peak, even though it excludes much of the land to the north that has the same potential. So, if they're claiming that this area here in Ontario has excellent potential, well, this is the same kind of potential. So this is rather misleading. This excludes much of the land to the north and east of that swath, and so doing so exaggerates the geographic extent of the so-called best solar resources in the country. You can see the drop-off here on the map of where the better resources actually are. And the rough equivalence of solar PV is insufficient. So with respect to Miami, which is down here, many comparisons are possible because solar systems can be configured in many different ways and can be placed in many different orientations relative to the path of the sun across the sky. If we assume identical arrays with two-axis tracking, a Miami system produces about 15% more energy on an annual basis than one in Medicine Hat. So, this is Miami, and up here is the Hat. If south-facing rooftop solar is assumed, then Miami system produces about 25% more energy. So two-axis tracking allows the solar panels to track both the north and south and east and west movements of the sun across the sky, thereby maximizing the conversion of the available solar energy into electricity. However, two-axis arrays are more expensive than fixed or single-axis arrays, and tracking is not applicable for rooftop installations. Oops. So, if we look at the U.S. National Renewable Energy Laboratory PV Watts web application, we find it produces a value of 8,567 kilowatt hours for a PV array in Miami, assuming the default array configuration, except for the use of a two-axis tracking. The corresponding value for Medicine Hat is 7,363, so that's quite a difference in kilowatt hours. With the two-axis tracking replaced by the default rooftop mount with a 20-degree tilt, the Miami value is 6,209 kilowatt hours, and the Medicine Hat value is 4,914 kilowatt hours. So you can see more of these details in the endnote, but you can see this is quite a significant difference. So any comparison between southern Alberta and Rio de Janeiro, which is another comparison that Pembina made, a city whose metropolitan area contains more than 12 million people, whose population density is 2,700 per square kilometer, compared to Calgary's 272 per square kilometer, and where per capita electricity use is 2,400 kilowatt hours a year versus Canada's of 13,085 kilowatt hours, would even be less useful. And just a reminder that, the words Rio and Miami conjure up images of warm, sunny beaches in the minds of readers, and that's likely intended by the Pembina report authors, but both cities are subjected to heavy cloud and a lot of rain during their summers. So the reference Pembina provides to support this Rio-Miami claim is no longer available. We can't comment on the basis for it. But in the end, however, it's much like the one that says this renewable plant can serve 10,000 homes. It may be true in a very narrow sense, but is not true in any practical or economic sense. In the end, Pembina's claim that solar resources in southern Alberta are like those in Miami and Rio de Janeiro is unsupported by facts. It's irrelevant, and at best, it's misleading. So just to be clear on this, I have here a globe, and you can see that here's Medicine Hat with the little smiley face, and here is Miami with another smiley face, and here, oops, way down here, here's Rio. So you can see it's where these places are on Earth will really affect the kind of sunlight that you get, and when you get it, and to what intensity. So they're not valid comparisons. That's the main point. Now, to do a fairly specific analysis here, and this gets into a bit of math, so it might be a little bit boring for some people, but I hope that we can do a good explanation here. This compares Miami and Medicine Hat, two different consumers. So even if we assume that a Medicine Hat solar energy system produces close enough as much energy as an identical Miami system, we've only addressed half the supply problem. To see how large the other half is, let's assume we want to serve a customer in Miami and a customer in Medicine Hat, who consume exactly the amount of energy produced by their own solar panels over the course of a year. To keep things simple, we'll assume for now that each customer's consumption is the same in all 12 months. So, since a 6 kilowatt rooftop mounted solar array in Miami produces 9,312 kilowatt hours in a typical year, while the same array in Medicine Hat produces 7,368 kilowatt hours, we'll assume that the customers use 776 and 614 kilowatt hours per month, respectively. So you can see that in the graph here. Let's look at the Miami customer first. In January, her solar panel produced 701, right? January, 701 kilowatt hours. And here is the demand. Let's just walk through the chart first. So the chart shows the monthly solar output as a solid line with dots. So this is the monthly solar output by month. And this is the demand of the customer, the use of the energy, or the need for the energy. The monthly energy surplus or shortfall is marked by these columns, and the cumulative energy surplus or shortfall is marked by the shaded area. So in January, her solar panel produced 701 kilowatt hours. So there was an energy shortfall of 776 minus 701, which equals 75 kilowatt hours. And we'll talk about how the shortfall was handled shortly. In February, the panel produced 705 kilowatt hours. The shortfall was 71 kilowatt hours, which we see in these columns. And the cumulative shortfall for the first 2 months was 146 kilowatt hours. So that's this shaded area here. In March, the panel output was 887 kilowatt hours, which was 111 kilowatt hours more than usage. So you can see that up here in the dotted lines. You can see that it's now gone above the energy demand line. So the cumulative shortfall decreased to 35 kilowatt hours. April's 890 kilowatt hour output resulted in a surplus for the month of 114 kilowatt hours, which you can see in the columns, and caused the cumulative shortfall to switch to a cumulative surplus of 79 kilowatt hours. So you can go through similar calculations for the remainder of the year, and you see that the peak cumulative surplus of 276 kilowatt hours was reached at the end of August, and the energy shortfalls from September through December consumed it. So by the end of December, total consumption and total solar energy both reached 9,312 kilowatt hours. So that was actually, in terms of overall energy generation and consumption, that's a good match, even though the timing is not good. You can see there are gaps here, right? But what happens when we go to Medicine Hat? So as we showed you on the globe, Medicine Hat is much farther north. The seasonal variability is really extreme compared to Miami. Again, this is the energy demand, which we set at a common monthly average just for simplicity. This is the actual energy generated, the solar output, a solid line here, and the columns show the surplus or shortfall, and the shaded area shows the cumulative energy surplus or shortfall at the end of each month. So the Medicine Hat customer's January electricity consumption was 614 kilowatt hours. But his solar panel output was only 291 kilowatt hours. So that's quite a gap. And you can see that on the graph. His energy shortfall was 323 kilowatt hours. This is far larger than the Miami customer's January shortfall, even though the Medicine Hat consumption was much less. And completing the calculations for all months shows that a minimum cumulative shortfall of 560 kilowatt hours was reached at the end of February, and a maximum cumulative surplus of 780 kilowatt hours was reached at the end of September. As we'll see in the next section, the fact that these surpluses and shortfalls are much larger than those in Miami has huge implications for the Albertan. The differences between Miami and Medicine Hat are inescapable consequences of the greater seasonal variation of solar energy at higher latitudes, and they clearly show why simply comparing annual energy production between solar arrays in different parts of the world is meaningless. Now, on top of this, we've also been told that we're going to decarbonize and everything will be electrified. So decarbonization means no more use of fossil fuels, and natural gas is a fossil fuel. So what we're talking about is the elimination of fossil fuels, the elimination of natural gas. So for heating your home, your water boiler, your kitchen stove, your oven perhaps, almost all of the heating resources for Albertans are natural gas. So the idea is to replace that with electricity. And for that we would need much more electrical generation, and it would also have to be reliable, and or we would have to add storage, because presently the fossil fuels are the storage, if you like. They are the backup system. So let's have a look and see how much that will cost, and especially how much it will cost the person in Medicine Hat. So eliminating fossil fuels would require, among other things, that we convert home heating systems, water heaters, and cooking appliances from natural gas to electricity. Since the average Alberta home uses 100 gigajoules of natural gas each year, the conversion would add almost 28,000 kilowatt hours per year to the average home's electricity consumption. The vast majority of the new demand will appear in winter, and based on residential natural gas usage. The data from 2015 to 2019 from the Alberta Energy Regulator, December and January each account for 15% of annual gas consumption, while June, July, and August are each under 3%. So these numbers translate into roughly 4,200 kilowatt hours per month of incremental electricity use in the winter, and about 700 kilowatt hours per month in the summer. Adding the monthly increments to the 614 kilowatt hour per month that we had assumed above, and scaling up the solar array to 29 kilowatts to rebalance the annual energy supply and demand, and recalculating the monthly and cumulative shortfalls gives us figure 5, which we'll look at in a moment. The cumulative shortfall now reaches 7,260 kilowatt hours, which is 13 times larger than before the conversion, while the cumulative surplus reaches 6,340 kilowatt hours, which is 8 times larger than before. So this is a mythical graph, because this is the future Medicine Hat with no fossil fuels. Okay, so as the graphs before, we see the monthly solar output is this solid line with the markers. The monthly electricity demand is the dotted line. The monthly energy surplus or shortfall, the surplus, the shortfall are marked by the columns. And the cumulative energy surplus or shortfall, this is the shortfall, this is the surplus, are marked in shaded areas. And this scale is quite different than the other ones. So this is not an exact comparison to the previous graphs. So this chart is the same as figures 3 and 4, except that it's for future Medicine Hat, where the residential use of fossil fuels is assumed to have been eliminated. The anti-correlation between solar generation and electricity demand is obvious. So you can see here, and here, and again here. Caution must be used when comparing this chart to figures 3 and 4 because this vertical scale is quite different. But anyway, the main point of this graph is that when you really need power, you won't have it, and you won't have much of it at all. So today, most consumers' energy surpluses and shortfalls are managed through connections to their respective power grids, which in both Florida and Alberta are supplied largely by fossil fuel generators. So in Florida, for instance, 15% comes from coal, 64% from natural gas, petroleum 1%, renewables 4.3%, and nuclear 15%. And for Alberta, you can go on the Alberta Electric System Operator website, and you can find the market supply and demand report, which is updated every 15 minutes. So that can give you very good insight on what's performing at what time in Alberta. So shortfalls are covered by importing power from the grid, while surpluses are managed by exporting power to it. So let's assume our two customers believe Pembina's claim that solar is among the cheapest forms of new generation, and they decide to try disconnecting from the grid to save money and eliminate their own use of fossil fuels. Let's also assume that they decide to use batteries to supply their electricity, when the sun is not shining, as many renewable energy advocates believe they can do today? Well, we're going to show you how Pembina ignored the huge cost of the energy storage needed for solar generation. So let's go back to our Miami customer using the flat consumption average that we came up with. Her battery must be charged to 146 kilowatt hours on January the 1st to avoid having an energy shortfall, that means lights out, period in February. This requires a solar and battery system that can store up to 422 kilowatt hours. That's about 17 days worth of consumption. So that's for Miami. The Medicine Hat customer, also the flat consumption rate. The battery must initially be charged to 560 kilowatt hours. It must therefore be capable of storing 560 plus 780 equals 1,340 kilowatt hours, or about 66 days worth of consumption. These numbers refute the notion that solar energy systems require only a few days worth of backup storage to get through a cloudy period. And comparing the two locations further negates the claim that solar resources in southern Alberta are equivalent to those in southern Florida. This number is based on the assumption of infinitely flexible batteries with no round-trip losses, and in reality, losses of about 10% can be expected. So when you're charging and recharging and discharging batteries, there are losses. And if we look at the cost of battery storage, so for Miami, the cost of batteries for the Miami customer would be 550 times 422, which would be about 232,100 Canadian dollars. And since the cost of solar panels is so small compared to the cost of batteries, let's just assume they're free. So if her system never needs maintenance, if her batteries last a rather optimistic 10 years without degradation, and if she can borrow money at zero interest, her annual cost would be about $23,000 Canadian divided by 9,312 kilowatt hours a year. That's at roughly $2.50 per kilowatt hour Canadian. Meanwhile, the person in Medicine Hat, the Medicine Hat customer's batteries would cost 550 times 1,340, or $737,000, and under the same assumptions, his cost would be $73,700 per year, or $10 per kilowatt hour. This compares to the approximate 17 cents per kilowatt hour. This is based on $1,253 a year for 7,368 kilowatt hours. That's what Alberta residential consumers spend today for electricity, and this 17-cent rate includes energy, transmission, distribution charges, administration fees, and taxes. So the absurdity of this result hits home when we realize that since the median after-tax income in Alberta in 2019 was $72,500, most Albertans would be unable to buy the amount of electricity they use today, even if they stopped buying food. So Pembina's claim that our electricity sector has entered a new reality where renewable generation is the most economic source of new electricity generation for the province, it's categorically wrong. So there's already a huge mismatch between reality and Pembina's claim, and this will become even larger if a gas to electricity conversion is forced on consumers. If the Medicine Hat customer were to convert his natural gas consumption to electricity and scale up his solar array to match his annual energy demand, assuming he has the roof space to do so, rather than 1,340 kilowatt hours of storage, you would need 13,600 kilowatt hours of storage. That's about 70% of the storage capacity of TransAlta's wind charger battery facility, shown here under construction. And it would cost more than $7 million at the assumed rate of $550 per kilowatt hour. But even that number is too low because we have yet to account for the battery's round-trip energy losses and capacity degradation over time. The electrification of transportation, adding of EVs to the grid, or the additional storage that would be needed in the colder than average or cloudier than average years. And as for the idea that batteries in electric vehicles can help, most personal EVs store 100 kilowatt hours or less. So that's a minuscule fraction of what would be needed. So you can read a bit more about this project here. Chris Barco wrote an article in the Calgary Herald about it. So can we afford to listen to Pembina Institute's advice? This is figure 6. This is Canadian dollars per year on this side. The cost of Alberta home electricity and natural gas today is about $2,046 a year. The Miami solar energy cost, $23,000 a year. That's the solar and battery electricity if we did that today. The median income of Albertans is $72,500 based on 2019. But the Medicine Hat solar energy cost, this would be the same price as what people have for income on a per capita basis. And not on a per capita basis. This would be the median income. So you can see that it's actually more than the median income if we did the Medicine Hat solar energy cost. And if we convert to natural gas, the cost skyrockets to more than $700,000. This is future Medicine Hat, all electric. So if we drew this actual arrow here, it would go way up to the top of the page before. So it's a ludicrous proposition, and people need to be aware of these very serious implications. But what about demand management? Demand management, people say, well, what if we just cut back? What if we schedule times for people to use electricity? So on page 4, Pembina states, combined with other technologies such as energy storage and demand-side management, wind and solar can contribute to a clean energy portfolio that can provide a reliable supply of electricity to the grid at all times. This sounds wonderful, but in the absence of much more information, it's a hollow statement. Would Pembina consider that we have a reliable grid if the cost of a wind, solar, and storage power system to the average homeowner is $10 per kilowatt hour, or even $1 per kilowatt hour, with the demand destruction that those prices would entail? Or how about using smart meters to turn off the power to tens of thousands of homes, businesses, schools, shopping centers, seniors' homes, and hospitals? Is that an acceptable form of demand management when storage has been exhausted, when the sun has set, when wind generation is producing at just a few % of installed capacity? Look at what the rate is today. This is the rate for electricity from the Alberta Utilities Commission, and this is in cents per kilowatt hour. 7.2, 6.7, 7, 6.9. So just going back here, do you really want to pay $10 a kilowatt hour? $1 a kilowatt hour? Think about what that would do to industry and consumers in Alberta. You maybe have heard the phrase heat or eat poverty. It would be way worse than that. So, with all these facts in mind, now that we've walked through these statistical and quantitative analyses, you might be asking yourself, so why is it then that solar energy is being built in Alberta at all? Well, that's a good question. Part of it is that influential parties have lobbied for solar energy policies, renewable policies, and they've gotten them. So that's become an attractive option for solar generators. So they've come to Alberta looking for a good investment, but it's a good investment for them, not for you and I. Part of that we've seen already, and we'll have a look at some more here. So the obvious question is, if solar generation is absurdly expensive when all costs are considered, how could it be that solar farms are being built at a fairly rapid pace in Alberta today? As alluded to above, there are two main reasons. First, fossil fuel generators are still allowed to exist, and they provide the energy needed when the sun is not shining or the wind is not blowing, and they do so at a tiny fraction of the cost of batteries. Secondly, both residential and commercial solar generators in Alberta are the beneficiaries of massive, growing, and mostly hidden subsidies that make solar projects economic for their owners, but they offload large costs onto consumers. And we'll explore these points in upcoming parts of our rebuttal to Pembina. So in conclusion, the Miami to Medicine Hat comparisons are invalid. So claims like this solar facility can provide enough energy to serve 10,000 homes are misleading, because having enough energy by itself does not lead to a reliable year-round supply of electricity for Alberta homes. And number two, Pembina's claims that southern Alberta solar resources are excellent and equivalent to those of Rio de Janeiro and Miami are based on cherry-picked comparators. While solar energy is indeed more plentiful in southern Alberta than in most of Canada, it's no better than middle of the pack when seen in a global context. Pembina could have, but for obvious reasons did not, compare southern Alberta to Phoenix, Arizona, or El Paso, Texas. And in addition, the seasonal variation of solar energy in Medicine Hat results in storage requirements that are much greater than those in Miami. So power generation is very complex. Batteries are needed for more than just a few days of storage, as we've seen. And as we move further away from the equator, solar energy's seasonal variation gets larger, and electricity demand tends to shift from summer peaking to winter peaking. In Alberta, the winter peaks will become vastly larger if consumers are forced to convert from natural gas heating to electric heating. The changes in supply and demand that occur as we move to higher latitudes increase the amount of storage needed to turn solar generators into reliable energy sources. And in Alberta, the needed storage is not just that required to get through a few cloudy days, but rather that required to get through the October to March solar energy shortfall. And this amount of battery storage, as we've shown you, is not economically feasible for Alberta families. So I hope that you will read the full report. It's on our blog, and I will post this PowerPoint on the blog as well, so you can go through the detail of it. The report has quite a few more statistics, and it does quite a bit more of the qualitative analysis, and you'll be able to flesh out more of the details. It's fully footnoted, so there's lots of endnotes that can help you understand the details or go back and look at the original sources. And our team of engineers want to say also that we are interested in open civil debate. We have all of the materials that can be made available to Pembina Institute or any party that would like to debate or discuss our findings. And the idea here is to inform the public and policymakers of some of the missteps that are being made now that could become extremely expensive and even dangerous for Albertans. And some of the things in this report apply to other jurisdictions, but perhaps not at the same scale, partly because of geography and partly because every power generation mix in different parts of the world is quite different. Some places use a lot of hydro, like in Norway, that might invalidate some of the statements here. And some places maybe use a lot of coal that might also invalidate some of the statements. So it really depends on your region's or your jurisdiction's energy mix as to how some of these principles apply. But you can see that there's much more to analyzing wind and solar on the grid than just doing simple math. It's a very complex quantitative analysis that must be done in order to arrive at good public policy. And let's see, we've got some other reports here that we can share with you. These are related reports. This one we recently released called The True Cost of Wind and Solar Electricity in Alberta. This is also a very good report and does a similar kind of analysis, but for wind and solar. In the Dark on Renewables we released some time ago, but it also walks you through and also includes things like the LCOE, the levelized cost of energy. And you can see what the comparisons are there. Why Renewable Energy Cannot Replace Fossil Fuels by 2050 was written by Robert Lyman and also reviewed by professional engineer Kent Zare. And this is really a mind-blowing report because it really wakes you up. You know, it's one thing to say, oh, let's replace fossil fuels. Now, even if we could replace fossil fuels by wind and solar, just the complications of trying to make enough wind and solar devices in the time frame proposed is ludicrous. But please read the report and see the math. And here we have another report by Robert Lyman where he's looking at the inconvenient facts about renewable energy on a global basis. And another one that you might want to have a look at, speaking of a different power grid, this would be the Ontario Climate Legacy. And this is also written by Robert Lyman. And again, as I mentioned before, power grids are different in different parts of the country. And in Ontario, it's largely based on nuclear and hydro. But you will see in this report how the addition of wind and solar really made a terrible mess for that province. And terrible costs, and we should try and avoid that in Alberta. We've got lots of evidence to learn from. Let's not do it. And about us, well, we're an independent group of earth, atmospheric, and solar scientists and engineers and citizens. We're celebrating our 19th year of offering climate science insights. And after a thorough review of a broad spectrum of literature on climate change, Friends of Science Society has concluded that the sun is the main driver of climate change, not carbon dioxide. So you can find out a lot more of that climate science on our main website, which is noted here. And you can donate to us if you like what we do. We are always happy to receive questions and comments. We like to engage in civil debate, so we hope that you can keep your comments civil. And I'd now be very happy to take some questions. And I would like to say, you know, I'm a spokesperson for Friends of Science Society. I'm not a professional engineer or a scientist, but I rely on the materials that our people put together. And I hope that you look at the original materials to get the actual details of the things that I've been presenting, especially this evening, as it is rather more technical material. You know, we have a small, dedicated group of volunteers who really work very hard to bring this information to the public. And the only purpose is that we should have good public policy. We should have informed, open civil debate. We should have full cost-benefit analysis. And as we did tonight, we should have quantitative analyses that really help people understand the implications of many of the Go Green proposals that are being put forward at this time. There are lots of hidden landmines in many of the assumptions about green energy. So I hope that you will take time to consider our offerings and share it with your friends and family and people that are decision makers. Now I'm just going to check and see if I have any questions coming in, because the technical team was going to be drawing in some questions from the chat. Okay, here we have some. Okay. One person has mentioned that I noted 5 requirements for electrical power, and he says that there's a 6th that is critical. It must be dispatchable or controllable to maintain grid stability, and that's true. I think the word that I had used was flexible, and I think that the people who wrote that list intended that it be dispatchable, or that flexible reflect the need to be dispatchable. So dispatchable is like your gas stove, if you want more heat, you turn up the heat, you want less, you turn it down. But you can't do that with wind and solar because they are weather dependent. Another person has written, "Hi from Montreal. I can't stay in this presentation and I'll watch it another time on my own, but I have a question for the Q&A. What do you guys think of bladeless wind energy?" Well, we'll have to put that to our engineers. I haven't looked into it that much myself, but we will get back to you. Maybe we'll post it on our blog, or we'll just send you a little note. Another person says, "Where does all the waste go when they go faulty?" Well, there's just a recent report out from the Harvard School of Business. Michael Schellenberger has been writing about it a lot. The waste is usually dumped. Solar panels do not have a viable recycling method at this time. It's very, very expensive. So they're often just dumped in landfills. And unfortunately, there are quite a few elements in solar panels that are very toxic. So this is really a big problem. And as far as I understand, in Canada, solar farm operators do not have the same kind of stringent environmental regulations that oil and gas and coal operators have to observe. So they don't have to go through the same environmental impact process. All of the major oil and gas facilities, before they're even built, they have to submit a complete decommissioning plan so that at the end of the useful life of that facility, people know already how it will be taken down and where it will go and what will be done with it. That is not the case for solar panels and solar farms and wind turbines, to the best of my knowledge. So there is quite a bit of dumping going on in Africa, where panels are just dumped there. And that's really a tragedy, because to have a good environmental management, you need to have money. So when you're dumping broken things in poor countries, you're just making their life more miserable. Let's see. The map on the screen is in the FOSS report. Well, Pembina's map was self-drawn and shown only in Canada. Okay, this is for slide 18. All right. So that's information for our viewers. And another person comments that the Miami versus Medicine Hat comparison is missing the fact that the demand also changes over the year. In winter, when solar is at its lowest in the Hat, is also when the demand is at the highest level. That is true. We did kind of illustrate that, but we had gone with the sort of a flat average consumption so as not to get too crazy on the graphs, because it was just intended as an example. But that's very true. Let me see if we have any other questions. Okay, I don't see any right here. Checking the spam. So just for a moment here, we'll go back to those. just have a look at. These are the items here: abundant, affordable, reliable, scalable, and flexible. So yes, dispatchable. I think that that's what was intended there. So I don't see any more questions here in the chat. I'll just check the spam. We have a couple of other items on our blog. Oh, listing the toxic elements in solar panels. So the toxic elements in solar panels they're chemicals that include cadmium, telluride, copper, indium selenide, cadmium gallium diselenide, copper indium gallium diselenide, hexafluoroethane, lead, and polyvinyl fluoride. Silicon tetrachloride is a byproduct of producing crystalline silicon, and it's also highly toxic. So those are some of the dreadful outcomes of solar. As I mentioned, we have a couple of other items on our blog. We have one which looks at the solar panels, or the solar farm for Carmangay, the village of Carmangay in Alberta. We have another assessment of EVs for Alberta, where we critique, I believe it was a CTV story, where they claimed that we would have 600,000 EVs in Alberta in the next 5 years, and that's just not possible. We, again, would have to see a massive expansion of the power generation facilities and the grid. It would cost a fortune, and very, very unlikely to happen, not to mention sales are not at that level. And we have another blog post about the reality of solar generation. So if you go through our blog, you can see some of those things. Let me see if I have any more questions here. Yeah, we have another item on our blog called Hope and Disappointment. And it's by a farmer on the prairies who put in a solar system, hoping to be able to maintain power when he has occasional blackouts, because he's kind of out in the middle of nowhere. But he found it quite disappointing, and he's also very concerned that the panels may just be junked when they're finished their lifespan. Like, there's no recycling facility available for them. So that's a very big concern of his. So I know that this presentation was a bit more technical than some of the ones that we've done. We're hoping to do Robert Lyman's Hazards Ahead, which is part 2 of his JP Morgan analysis. So we're hoping to be able to do that one coming back probably July 8th or so. But you'll see an announcement on our YouTube channel. And we're going to continue to do these live streams. So again, if you have an idea for something you'd like to see in a live stream, if you have a special guest you'd like us to try and get on board, we're just starting out doing our live streams, so we're doing the simpler versions of them as we go. But we'd be happy to hear from you, and we thank everyone for joining us this evening. And we hope that you will carry on this information, again, look at the report, see the detail in the report and understand what it is. I mean, I just covered some of the highlights tonight. But I want to thank my technical producer, Jay. I want to thank the team at Friends of Science Society, the volunteers who work so hard to make it all happen. And I want to thank all of you, all of our supporters, and all of you who are tuning in tonight just to listen and understand what's going on. Again, our climate science view is that the sun is the main driver of climate change, not the only driver. We agree that carbon dioxide does have a role, but it's nominal compared to the influence of natural factors. And you can also find more information about other dissenting scientists by looking up Clintel. Clintel.org is the climate intelligence unit out of Holland. There are over 900 scientists who are signatory to the World Climate Declaration of Clintel. And basically they say there's no climate emergency and that natural forces are more influential than humans on climate. Now, statements like that don't mean we shouldn't take care of our environment. You know, so many times people say, oh, you don't care about the environment, do you? That's not true at all. Many of our people, many of our members are professional engineers, and many of them have either patents or they have designed or implemented technologies that reduce pollution in many different ways. So they actually know how difficult it is to do these things and how important it is to do these things, and they've done them. So protecting the environment is very important to us, but also protecting society is very important. And that means we need to have affordable, reliable, efficient, and dependable power generation for our modern world. And wind and solar are not in that category. And that's what we tried to show you tonight. We tried to show you why. So I hope you enjoyed this evening's presentation, and feel free to donate, become a member, or send in your comments. And thank you very much. For Friends of Science Society,